Detective Isabella Rossi, her face illuminated by the harsh blue light of her phone, leaned toward a man huddled in a worn-out coat. "Mr. Price," she said, her voice cutting through the sterile silence of the police interrogation room, "we need you to look at this. Where did you see this girl?" The screen showed a photo of a smiling child. The man, Calvin Price, flinched, his mind flashing back to the jeers he endured just days earlier in the park, the laughter echoing in his ears as people pointed at the very drawing that had brought him here. Look at his fantasy drawings, they had sneered. But it wasn't a fantasy. He knew it, and now, the whole world was about to find out. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The air in Westgate Park carried the complex perfume of a city in mid-autumn. A crisp, almost sharp breeze funneled between the skyscrapers, carrying the scent of roasted nuts from a vendor's cart, a smell that mingled with the acrid tang of distant exhaust fumes. Fallen leaves, a kaleidoscope of gold, crimson, and brittle brown, skittered across the pavement in frantic, whispering dances, chased by the wind. Somewhere in the urban symphony, a siren wailed, its cry rising and falling like a lament. On his usual bench, the one with a clear view of the main promenade but just far enough from the children's playground to avoid suspicion, sat Calvin Price. He was a figure so still, so blended into the muted tones of the park, that he had become part of the background scenery, as easily overlooked as a crack in the pavement or a pigeon pecking at discarded crumbs. His appearance was a testament to a life lived on the margins. The threadbare jacket he wore had seen too many winters, its fabric worn thin at the elbows and its collar frayed into a soft fringe. Deep lines were etched around his eyes, grooves carved not by age but by hardship, by squinting against the sun in summer and the biting wind in winter. They were lines that spoke of worry, of hunger, of a constant, low-level vigilance. Yet, the hands that emerged from the cuffs of that worn jacket were something else entirely. They were calloused, yes, and smudged with the permanent grime of the streets, but they moved with a careful, almost reverent grace. Cradled in his lap was a sketchbook, its cover softened and bent with use, and clutched in his right hand was a stick of charcoal. These were his only worldly treasures, the anchor that kept him from drifting away completely. He was utterly absorbed in his work, his head bent, his focus absolute. His hand moved with a practiced fluidity that was a stark, startling contrast to his rough, unkempt appearance. He wasn't just doodling or sketching aimlessly to pass the time. He was capturing a moment, resurrecting a feeling from the vault of his memory. His eyes, when they did lift from the page, darted around the park, not with the furtive glances of a homeless man looking for threats or opportunities, but with the keen, cataloging gaze of an artist. He was observing the slant of the afternoon light as it filtered through the thinning canopy of an old oak, the specific way a young mother impatiently pushed a stroller, the joyful arc of a dog leaping for a frisbee. But his drawing was not of the present. He was focused on a memory from a few days prior, a flicker of warmth in the cold expanse of his existence. In the quiet sanctuary of his mind, where the charcoal met the paper, Calvin found a sense of peace that the world outside could never offer. The judgments, the averted gazes, the muttered insults, they all faded away, leaving only the clean, satisfying scrape of the charcoal and the emerging lines on the paper. The world became silent, orderly, a place where he was in control. He was thinking of her. The little girl. He hadn't known her name, of course. He didn't know the names of any of the people who populated his world. But he remembered her. She had a bright red coat, a splash of brilliant color against the park's muted palette. He had been shivering, a deep, uncontrollable tremor that shook his entire frame, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and refuses to leave. The girl, who couldn't have been more than 8, had been walking with her mother, clutching a large, round cookie. She had stopped in front of his bench and simply stared at him, her expression not one of fear or disgust, but of solemn curiosity. Then, without a word, she had carefully broken the cookie in half, the snap echoing in the cold air. She had held out the larger piece to him, her small hand steady, her eyes wide and serious. The simple, profound kindness of the act had struck him dumb. It was a gesture devoid of pity, a pure, uncomplicated offering of shared warmth. He had taken it, his rough fingers brushing against hers, and mumbled a thank you that was lost in the wind. Now, he drew her from that memory. He wasn't just sketching a generic child, he was capturing her. He labored over the light in her eyes, that look of earnest concentration she had as she broke the cookie. He remembered the specific way her hair fell across her forehead. And most vividly, he remembered the pin on the collar of her red coat. It was a small, silver bird, a sparrow or a finch, its wings slightly spread as if about to take flight. He drew it with meticulous care, the tiny detail a focal point of the entire image, the heart of the memory. He was so lost in his work that he didn't notice them at first. A group of college students, loud and boisterous, their laughter echoing unnaturally loud in the calm afternoon. They were a whirlwind of expensive jackets, designer sneakers, and the self-assured confidence of youth. "Hey, let's see what the master artist is creating," one of them, a young man with a booming voice and a cruel smirk, said as they approached. Before Calvin could react, the young man leaned over and snatched a look at the open sketchbook. "Whoa, check it out," he bellowed to his friends. "He's drawing imaginary friends." The group erupted in laughter, a sound that was sharp and piercing, a stark violation of the peace Calvin had built around himself. One of the young women, Jenna, felt a fleeting pang of pity, but it was quickly overshadowed by a misguided sense of anthropological interest, and the undeniable pressure of her peers. She saw the world through the lens of her smartphone, every moment a potential post, a story to be curated and shared for validation. Egged on by her friends, she stepped closer. "It's actually kind of beautiful," she said, her voice carrying a tone of detached analysis. She raised her phone. Snap. The photo captured the drawing perfectly, the charcoal line stark against the white paper. Later that evening, in the warmth of her dorm room, Jenna posted the photo to her Instagram story. She spent a few moments crafting the perfect caption, one she thought was poetic and sensitive, but which came off as deeply condescending. "In a world of his own," she wrote beneath the image of Calvin's drawing. "This homeless artist in the park draws the most vivid fantasy people. There's a sad beauty to it." The image itself was striking. The drawing of the child was rendered with an unnerving realism, especially the eyes, which seemed to hold a light of their own. Behind the girl, Calvin had sketched in the carousel from the city fair that had been set up nearby a week ago, its whimsical horses and ornate decorations creating a background that, to an outsider like Jenna, seemed slightly surreal, adding to the impression that this was a scene born purely of imagination. For Calvin, the laughter was a physical blow. He felt a familiar, crushing wave of shame wash over him, the cold tide of invisibility that had been his constant companion for years. He didn't retaliate. He didn't even speak. To speak would be to acknowledge them, to give their cruelty a purchase in his world. Instead, he simply closed his sketchbook, the soft thud of the cover sounding like a door slamming shut on his brief moment of peace. The charcoal dust on his fingers, which moments before had been the medium of his creation, now felt like grit in a wound. He slowly, methodically, packed his meager belongings, the sketchbook and his precious few sticks of charcoal, into a worn plastic bag. He stood up, his joints aching, and shuffled away from the bench, the laughter of the students following him like a persistent, mocking shadow. He didn't look back. He retreated into the urban wilderness, his steps leading him toward the cold solitude of the underpass he called home. The concrete walls, stained and damp, offered a different kind of chill than the park, a deeper, more permanent cold. As he huddled under the roaring noise of the traffic overhead, the memory of the little girl's kindness, once a small, warm flame, was now tainted, the smoke of the world's cruelty stinging his eyes. The Thompson residence was a house drowning in silence. It was an opulent, modern structure of glass and steel, with soaring ceilings and minimalist furniture that had once been featured in an architectural magazine. Now, the clean lines and vast, open spaces only served to amplify the emptiness. The air, once filled with the laughter of an 8-year-old girl, was now thick and heavy with unspoken grief, a palpable presence that clung to the expensive art on the walls and settled like dust on the polished marble countertops. On one of those countertops, a stack of missing posters sat in a neat, heartbreaking pile. They showed the smiling face of their daughter, Lily, her eyes bright, her 2 front teeth missing. The sight of them was a constant, twisting knife in the gut. Sarah and David Thompson were frayed, their once solid relationship now strained to the breaking point under the unbearable weight of their daughter's disappearance. It had been 8 days. 8 eternities. David paced the length of the vast living room, his footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors, his movements sharp and angry. He was a man who fixed problems, who made deals, who controlled outcomes. This helplessness was a poison in his veins. "The police have nothing," he said, his voice a low, furious growl. He stopped and ran a hand through his hair, his knuckles white. "It's been 8 days, Sarah. 8 days, and they're telling us to be patient. What are we supposed to do?" Sarah was sitting on a cream-colored sofa, her body curled into itself as if trying to shrink away from the pain. She was staring blankly at her phone, her thumb mechanically scrolling through an endless gallery of photos: Lily at the beach, Lily on her first day of school, Lily covered in chocolate cake on her last birthday. Each image was a ghost. "We have to have hope, David," she whispered, her voice thin and brittle, like a dry leaf. "We have to." "Hope?" David's voice cracked. "Hope isn't going to find her. We should be doing more. Hiring private investigators, offering a bigger reward, something." "We are doing everything," Sarah replied, her gaze still fixed on the tiny, glowing screen. "The police said more investigators would just complicate things." Their conversation was clipped, each word a carefully placed stone, building a wall between them. They were 2 people trapped in the same nightmare, but grieving in separate, lonely worlds, terrified that if they truly reached for each other, they would both shatter completely. The doorbell chimed, a jarring, unwelcome sound in the suffocating quiet. It was Sarah's younger sister, Chloe, her face etched with worry. She had been coming every day, bringing groceries they didn't eat and offering a steady, calming presence that was the only thing keeping Sarah from dissolving entirely. While Sarah went to the kitchen to make tea, a hollow ritual of normalcy, Chloe sat on the sofa, pulling out her own phone. She wasn't being callous, she was simply trying to find a momentary distraction, a brief escape from the oppressive atmosphere of the house. She idly scrolled through her social media feed, her mind a numb buzz of celebrity gossip and vacation photos. Then she stopped. Her thumb froze mid-scroll. Her breath caught in her throat. On her screen was a drawing. It was a repost, shared from a popular news aggregator, which had picked it up from a student's viral story. The caption read, "In a world of his own. This homeless artist in the park draws the most vivid fantasy people." But it wasn't the caption that made Chloe's blood run cold. It was the image. A little girl in a red coat. A girl with familiar eyes. "Sarah," Chloe said, her voice barely a whisper. It was too quiet. She tried again, louder this time, a note of frantic urgency in her tone. "Sarah, you need to see this." Sarah rushed back into the room, a half-filled teacup rattling in her hand. "What is it?" she asked, her heart leaping into her throat, conditioned by a week of false alarms and dead-end tips. Chloe simply held out the phone. Sarah looked. A sharp, strangled gasp escaped her lips, her hand flying to her mouth. The drawing was stylized, the work of an artist with a unique perspective, but the details, oh God, the details were undeniable. They were perfect. Her voice trembled, shaking with a violent, burgeoning hope that was almost as painful as despair. "The coat," she breathed, her finger tracing the image on the screen. "That's the red coat I bought her for her birthday. And the pin. The little bird pin my mother gave her. David, look." She snatched the phone and scrambled over to her husband, shoving it in front of his face. David squinted at the screen, his expression a mask of protective skepticism. He had ridden too many roller coasters of false hope this past week, and the crashes were devastating. "Honey, it's a drawing," he said gently, trying to temper her expectation. "It could be anyone. A coincidence." "No," Sarah insisted, her voice gaining a strength it hadn't had in days. She was a mother lioness catching a scent. "It's not a coincidence. Look at the background, the carousel. That's the one from the fair. The one we went to the day she was taken. He saw her, David. Someone saw her that day. Her eyes, wild and desperate, locked onto his. Someone saw our baby. Without waiting for another word, Sarah was dialing the police hotline, her fingers fumbling but sure. When the operator answered, a torrent of desperate, energized words poured out of her, a flood of information about a drawing, a red coat, a bird pin, and a carousel. The lead, one of hundreds that had come in, was flagged and passed up the chain of command. Within minutes, an email with a link to the social media post landed in the inbox of Detective Isabella Rossi. Rossi was in her office, the blinds drawn against the late afternoon sun, a mountain of paperwork on her desk. The Thompson case file was open in front of her. She was tired, a deep, weary fatigue that came from staring into the abyss of human cruelty for too long. She saw the subject line of the email, possible lead, Lily Thompson case, social media post, and let out a sigh. Another internet psychic, she muttered to her partner, Detective Miller, who was nursing a cup of stale coffee nearby. She had seen it all before, well-intentioned people connecting random dots, desperate for a miracle. But procedure was procedure. She clicked the link. The image of the drawing filled her screen. She noted the condescending caption. Fantasy people. Her professional skepticism was firmly in place. Then, she opened a separate window with the official photo of Lily Thompson. She placed them side by side. She saw the resemblance, of course. A child with dark hair. But it was generic enough. Then she zoomed in. Her eyes narrowed. She zoomed in on the collar of the red coat in the drawing, and then on the collar of the coat in the official photograph. The bird pin. A tiny, silver sparrow, its wings slightly spread. It was a detail that had been deliberately withheld from the public, a piece of information known only to the family and the police, a way to filter out the fakes and the fame-seekers. Rossi's professional skepticism didn't just give way, it evaporated. A flicker of intense, electric interest sparked in her tired eyes. This was real. She stood up so fast her chair scraped loudly against the floor. Get a patrol car, she said to Miller, her voice sharp, clear, and devoid of any trace of fatigue. We need to find the man who drew this. Now. The search for Calvin Price began immediately. Rossi and Miller, armed with a screenshot of Calvin's face taken from a bystander's photo in the background of Jenna's post, started hitting the streets. They checked the city's homeless shelters, showing the grainy photo to overworked staff who shook their heads, the faces of the forgotten blending into one another. They walked through soup kitchens, the smell of disinfectant and boiled vegetables thick in the air, holding the phone out to men and women who looked away, their eyes filled with a weary distrust of any authority. For hours, they found nothing. The city was an expert at keeping its invisible people hidden. Finally, at a downtown mission, an old man with rheumy eyes recognized the face. Yeah, I've seen him, he rasped. Doesn't talk much. Likes to draw. Used to see him in Westgate Park all the time. Last I heard, he sleeps under the Jefferson Street overpass. Likes the quiet, I guess. The Jefferson Street overpass was a scar of concrete and steel, a place where the city's noise was amplified into a constant, deafening roar. The air was cold and damp, smelling of urine and stagnant water. Rossi and Miller found Calvin there, huddled against a concrete pylon, wrapped in his thin jacket and a tattered blanket. He was a small, still figure in the cavernous, roaring dark. From Calvin's perspective, the world was a blur of headlights and shadows. He was dozing, lost in a half-dream, when the sudden glare of headlights directly in his face jolted him awake. A police car. It had pulled right up onto the gravel shoulder, its doors opening. His heart seized in his chest, a cold, hard knot of pure terror. This was it. He was being arrested. For what, he didn't know. Vagrancy. Loitering. The crime of being poor and in the way. He braced himself for the worst, for the rough hands, the cold metal of handcuffs, the familiar humiliation. He watched as two figures approached, their silhouettes dark against the blinding lights. One was a woman, her expression unreadable in the glare. She moved with a purpose that terrified him. The entire hope of the Thompson family, the entire weight of a city's grief and a mother's prayer, now rested on this terrified, shivering man who believed his world was about to end. The contrast was stark, the powerful detective, armed with the authority of the law, and the powerless homeless man, armed with nothing but a sketchbook and a memory he didn't yet know was a key. The police station was an assault on the senses. From Calvin's perspective, it was a hostile, alien landscape. The fluorescent lights humming overhead were painfully bright, stripping all the color from the world and leaving everything in a harsh, sterile glare. The air, thick with the smells of antiseptic, stale coffee, and something vaguely metallic, burned the back of his throat. After the relative quiet of his life, a life lived to the soundtrack of wind and distant traffic, the cacophony of the station was overwhelming. Phones rang in a constant, shrill chorus, voices barked orders, and the clatter of keyboards and footsteps created a disorienting wall of sound. He felt like a specimen under a microscope, every frayed edge of his existence exposed and judged. He was led down a long, gray corridor into a small, gray interrogation room, a box of featureless walls and cold, hard surfaces. The door clicked shut behind him, and the sound seemed to seal him in. A uniformed officer, a man with a kind, tired face, entered a moment later. He wasn't Rossi. He placed a steaming styrofoam cup and a sandwich wrapped in wax paper on the metal table in front of Calvin. "Coffee," the officer said. "And a ham and cheese. Figured you might be hungry." Calvin stared at the offering, his first instinct a deep, ingrained suspicion. Nothing was ever free. But the hunger, a dull, persistent ache in his belly, was a more powerful force. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the sandwich. He unwrapped it slowly, with a deliberate caution, as if expecting it to be snatched away at any moment. He took a bite, then another, eating with a methodical slowness that spoke of years of uncertainty, of never knowing where the next meal would come from. He drank the coffee, letting the hot liquid chase away some of the chill that had settled deep in his bones. The door opened again, and this time it was the woman from the underpass, Detective Rossi. She moved with a quiet confidence that filled the small room. She sat in the chair opposite him, her gaze direct but not unkind. "Calvin," she began, her voice professional, level. "My name is Detective Rossi. I want to be very clear, you are not in any trouble. We need your help." She slid her phone across the table, the screen glowing. On it was the official school photograph of Lily Thompson, her smile bright, her eyes full of life. "We need to know about this girl." Calvin looked at the photo. The face was clearer now, sharper than his charcoal memory. The fear that had been a cold knot in his stomach for the past hour began to recede, replaced by a wave of recognition and a sudden, sharp pang of concern. It was her. "The little girl," he said, his voice raspy from disuse, a dry, dusty sound. "The one with the kind eyes." The memory flooded back, pure and untainted by the mockery that had followed. He wasn't a vagrant being processed, a problem being solved. He was a witness. "She gave me her cookie," he added softly, the words a statement of fact, a testament to her character. In his own mind, the shift was seismic. He was no longer a suspect, but a participant, a person with something to offer. Rossi leaned forward slightly, her focus entirely on him. She had a way of listening that made you feel like you were the only person in the world. "When did you see her, Calvin?" she asked gently. "Can you remember the day? Was she alone?" Calvin closed his eyes. It was a familiar reflex, the way he accessed his memories, not as a linear narrative, but as a series of images, drawings already etched in his mind. The chaotic noise of the station faded away, and he was back in the park, the autumn light filtering through the trees. "It was a few days before the picture people came," he said, his voice gaining a little more strength. "The fair was still there. The carousel." He paused, letting the scene assemble itself. She wasn't alone. She was with a man. A man? Rossi's voice was calm, but a new intensity sharpened its edge. Her father? Calvin shook his head, his eyes still closed. No. Not her father. He was holding her hand, but it looked tight. He opened his eyes, looking at Rossi, trying to find the words for what he had seen, for the subtle wrongness of the image. You know how a father holds a daughter's hand? It's loose. A guide. This was like holding a rope. His knuckles were white. This was it. This was the moment. The first real detail from a witness who had actually seen the abduction. What did he look like, Calvin? The man. Calvin's gaze drifted to the corner of the room, his artist's mind searching for the lines, the shapes, the shadows that formed the face. He was tall. Thin. He had a hat on, pulled down low. But he walked funny. He gestured with his hand, a slight, uneven bobbing motion. A limp. In his left leg. It was a small limp, but it was there. In his eyes, he kept looking around. Over his shoulder. Nervous. Like he was waiting for someone to see him. A thought sparked in Calvin's mind, a sudden, urgent need. My sketchbook, he said, his eyes meeting Rossi's again. The police who brought me here, they took it. Rossi nodded to the officer by the door, who left and returned a moment later with the worn, familiar object. He placed it on the table. Calvin's hands closed over it, a sense of relief washing over him as his fingers touched the bent cover. It was an extension of himself. Rossi pushed a fresh stick of charcoal across the table. Show me, Calvin, she said. He flipped to a clean page. The sterile room, the detective, the pressure, it all vanished. There was only the paper and the memory. His hand began to move, not with the tentative strokes of someone trying to remember, but with the confident, flowing lines of someone who already knew. The profile of the man emerged first, the sharp nose, the weak chin, the brim of the hat casting his eyes in shadow. But Calvin didn't stop there. He put her in a van, he said, his voice a low murmur, narrating the image as it appeared on the page. An old, white van. It was parked by the street, away from the other cars. He drew the vehicle, its boxy shape, a small dent on the rear bumper, a crack in the taillight. His memory was a high-resolution photograph. It had something on the side, he continued, his charcoal hovering over the side panel of the drawn van. A picture. A logo. His hand moved again, this time with a slow, deliberate precision. He drew a circle, and inside it, a tree. But it wasn't a healthy, vibrant tree. The branches on the left side were full, with leaves clearly depicted, but the branches on the right were bare, skeletal. From the bare side, a few leaves were drawn in the act of falling. It was a dying tree, Calvin said softly, looking up from his work. Half alive, half dead. Rossi stared at the drawing, mesmerized. This wasn't the confused, rambling testimony of an unreliable witness. This was the precise, detailed account of a highly observant man, an artist who saw the world in a way most people never did. The limp. The van. And now this, a logo so specific, so unusual, it was as good as a name. Her respect for this quiet, broken man grew with every stroke of his pencil. He was not a victim or a nuisance. He was a weapon. And for the first time in years, maybe even decades, Calvin felt seen. He felt the weight of his own worth. His art, the thing that had brought him both solace and ridicule, was not just a hobby or a curse. It was a tool. It had value. It mattered. Rossi carefully tore the page from the sketchbook, her movements precise, as if handling a priceless artifact. Thank you, Calvin, she said, her voice filled with a genuine respect that was more valuable to him than any meal or warm bed. She turned to her partner, Detective Jones, who had been watching from the doorway, his own expression a mixture of astonishment and dawning hope. Run this. Now, Rossi commanded, handing him the drawing. I want every landscaping, forestry, or environmental company in the tri-state area with a logo that looks anything like this. Check active companies, defunct companies, anything. I want to know who uses a dying tree as their symbol. The squad room, which had been humming with the low-grade tension of a stalled investigation, erupted into a focused flurry of activity. Jones scanned a drawing and broadcast it to every analyst on the floor. Keyboards clattered as detectives began running searches, their voices calling out database queries. The image of the dying tree was on every screen, a strange, melancholy symbol that now pulsed with a desperate urgency. For an hour, the search yielded nothing. Companies with trees in their logos were a dime a dozen, but none matched the specific, morbid design Calvin had rendered. The initial surge of adrenaline began to wane, replaced by the familiar specter of frustration. Then, a young analyst in the corner, a tech specialist who specialized in digging through digital graveyards, shouted, "Got something." All heads turned. "It's not active. Company named Thorn Landscaping. Went bankrupt 2 years ago. The logo is an exact match." He pulled up the archived company website. There it was. A stylized tree, half barren, with leaves falling from its withered branches. The name itself, Thorn, seemed like a cruel joke. Rossi was at his desk in a second. "Give me everything you have on them. I want a list of all former employees. Now." The analyst's fingers flew across the keyboard. A list of names, addresses, and social security numbers populated the screen. "Cross-reference this list with the Thompson case file," Rossi ordered. "Specifically, David Thompson's business interests. He's in real estate, he manages commercial properties. It's a long shot, but maybe one of these guys crossed his path." It wasn't a long shot. A name on the list of former Thorn Landscaping employees lit up, flagged by a keyword match from David Thompson's files. Marcus Thorn. The owner's son. He had been employed as a groundskeeper at a corporate park managed by David's real estate firm. A note in the file indicated his employment was terminated 3 months ago. Reason: theft of equipment. "Pull a full background on Marcus Thorn," Rossi snapped. The information came back within minutes, each new detail painting a more vivid and terrifying picture. A prior assault charge from 5 years ago. A recent address on a rural route 50 miles outside the city. And then, the final, chilling confirmation. They pulled his DMV record. Under medical information, a single line, "requires modified controls for left leg weakness due to work-related injury." He had a limp. Rossi grabbed her phone, her heart pounding. She walked back to the interrogation room, where Calvin was sitting quietly, his sketchbook open but his hands still. He looked up as she entered. "We think we found him, Calvin," she said, her voice low and steady. "Thanks to you." She then stepped out into the hall and dialed David Thompson's number. He answered on the first ring. "Detective? Do you have something?" "Mr. Thompson," Rossi said, keeping her voice as level as possible. "I need you to think carefully. Does the name Marcus Thorn mean anything to you?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, a sudden, sharp intake of breath. The silence stretched for a few seconds, thick with unspoken dread. When David's voice came back, it was tight, strained. "Thorn?" "Yes. He was a groundskeeper at the Northgate office park. I had him fired. He was stealing. He threatened me." David's voice broke. "He said I'd regret it. He said I'd pay for what I did. Oh, God." The guilt in his voice was a raw, open wound. The case, which had been a professional duty, had just become deeply, horribly personal. The monster had a name, and David Thompson had invited him into his life. A command post, little more than a cluster of unmarked vans bristling with antennae, had been established on a muddy access road a half-mile from the rural property address registered to Marcus Thorn. The farmhouse itself was a dark silhouette against a sky just beginning to bleed from black to deep indigo. It was a rundown, 2-story structure with a sagging porch and a large, dilapidated barn set further back, surrounded by acres of overgrown fields and skeletal trees. The air was cold and sharp, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Inside the lead van, the atmosphere was tense, a low hum of suppressed energy as the tactical team, dressed in black and armed with specialized equipment, waited for the final go, ahead. Their faces, illuminated by the green and blue glow of monitors, were grim and focused. Back at the station, in the relentless fluorescent glare of the squad room, Detective Rossi made a critical, unorthodox decision. Standard procedure dictated that Calvin, having provided his statement, should be handed over to social services or, at the very least, taken to a secure city shelter for the night. He was a civilian, a vulnerable one at that, and this was now an active, high-risk police operation. But Rossi looked at the quiet man sitting in the interrogation room, his sketchbook held loosely in his lap, and knew she couldn't let him go. His mind, his unique way of seeing the world, was their sharpest and most unconventional weapon. To send him away now would be like locking away their best piece of intelligence. She brought him to a small briefing room, a space dominated by a massive, wall-mounted monitor. With a few keystrokes, she pulled up a series of high-resolution satellite images of the Thorn property, the same images the tactical team was currently studying. The detail was extraordinary. You could see individual fence posts, the rust on the roof of a tractor, the shadows of the trees stretching like long, dark fingers across the fields. Calvin blinked, momentarily intimidated by the scale and clarity of the technology. It was a god's-eye view of a place he had never been. "Calvin," Rossi said, her voice low and serious, pulling his attention from the screen to her face. "I know this is a lot to ask." She gestured toward the monitor. "This is the property where we believe the man who took Lily is hiding. I need you to look at it. I know it's not the same as being there, but your memory, the way you see things, it's different. Does anything here feel familiar? Anything you might have noticed, even a little detail about the van, or the man, that might connect to this place?" Calvin slowly approached the screen, his initial apprehension giving way to a familiar, intense focus. This was just another canvas, a complex one, but a canvas nonetheless. His artist's eye began its work, not just looking for objects, but for patterns, for composition, for the subtle details that told a story. He wasn't a cop looking for entry points, he was an observer looking for meaning. His fingers, smudged with charcoal, rose to hover just inches from the screen, tracing the lines of the fences, the dark patches of woods, the curve of the dirt driveway. The other officers in the room, including Detective Jones, watched him, their skepticism a tangible presence. They saw a homeless man being asked to interpret complex tactical data, a well-intentioned but ultimately fruitless exercise. Then Calvin spoke, his voice quiet but clear. "The fence," he said, his finger tapping a section of the image on the far western edge of the property, a considerable distance from the main road and the farmhouse itself. "It's broken there." On the screen, it was a tiny disruption, a slight misalignment in the neat line of the perimeter fence that the analysts had noted but dismissed as unimportant. "It's a weak spot. An easy way in, or out, if you don't want to be seen from the road." He fell silent again, his eyes scanning the entire property, his mind working, connecting disparate sensory inputs. "The van," he said, his gaze distant for a moment. "When I saw it, when he put her inside, it was near a place that smelled like turpentine. Old paint. And something else, something sweet and dusty, like old hay." His finger moved from the broken fence line, across a wide, overgrown field, and settled on the isolated barn, set far back from the house. The satellite image showed the barn's roof was rusted, and the paint on its walls was visibly peeling, even from this height. "The paint on that building looks old," he said, his voice gaining a new, quiet authority. "Peeling. That's where the smell comes from. Maybe he's there." He looked at Rossi, his eyes certain. "Not the house. It's too close to the road. Too obvious. He's in the barn. It's separate. It's hidden." A hush fell over the room. Calvin was no longer just a witness recalling facts, he was a strategist, a profiler. He was using a unique, synesthetic memory, connecting a smell to a visual cue on a satellite map, making an intuitive leap that no trained officer could have replicated. He was seeing the emotional landscape of the place, not just the physical one. The other officers were no longer looking at a homeless man. They were looking at an expert. Their skepticism dissolved, replaced by a dawning, profound respect. Rossi grabbed her radio, her own voice now charged with Calvin's quiet conviction. She relayed the information to the tactical team leader, her words sharp and precise. New intel. We have a high confidence assessment that the target is not in the primary residence. He is in the barn, repeat, the barn. I want a new approach vector. West perimeter, broken fence line. It's a blind approach. Primary target is the barn. Acknowledge. The radio crackled in response, a calm, professional voice confirming the change in plan. The entire axis of the operation had just shifted, based on the word of a man who, 12 hours ago, was sleeping under a bridge. While Calvin was locked in the quiet, focused bubble of the police operation, the world outside had erupted. Jenna's casual, condescending social media post had mutated, spreading through the digital ecosystem like a wildfire. It had been picked up by local news blogs, then national outlets, and was now the lead story on every major cable news network. The narrative, however, had flipped completely. The initial tone of pity and mild amusement had been replaced by a breathless, sensationalized awe. News vans, like vultures sensing a kill, were camped outside the police station, their satellite dishes pointed at the sky. On television screens across the country, the story was being told and retold. Headlines blared across the bottom of the screen, stark and dramatic, homeless hero, artists drawing the key to finding missing girl. And, the invisible man, how a forgotten artist became a city's last hope. Calvin's drawing, once an object of ridicule, was now being analyzed by art critics and criminal profilers alike, hailed as a work of savant-like genius. His life story, or what little of it reporters could piece together from shelter records and interviews with other homeless individuals, was being spun into a modern-day fable. In her dorm room, the glow of a 24-hour news channel illuminating her pale, horrified face, Jenna watched the phenomenon she had created. Her phone had not stopped buzzing for hours, the screen a constant stream of notifications. She was inundated with messages, thousands of them. Some were from strangers praising her, calling her a hero for giving the man a voice. Others were filled with venom, vilifying her for her initial, cruel post, screenshots of which were now circulating as part of the story's before chapter. She was simultaneously the hero and the villain of a story that was growing more enormous and uncontrollable by the minute. Overwhelmed by a tidal wave of guilt, shame, and a terrifying sense of responsibility, she did the only thing she could think to do. She opened her laptop, started a live video feed, and spoke. Her voice, usually so confident and curated, was shaking, her eyes red and puffy. I never imagined this would happen, she began, her gaze fixed on the small green light of her webcam. The post I made, it was stupid. It was cruel. I'm so sorry for how I acted, for how I treated him. I can't even explain how much I regret it. She took a shaky breath, tears welling in her eyes. But right now, none of that matters. I don't matter. All that matters is that Lily Thompson is found. Please, just let her come home safe. The story was now a media spectacle, a runaway train of public emotion and speculation. It was bigger than Calvin, bigger than Lily, bigger than the Thompsons. It had become a story about society, about poverty, about art, about redemption. But the man at the center of it all, Calvin Price, remained completely, blissfully unaware of his newfound, explosive fame. He was in the quiet, sterile briefing room, a cup of lukewarm coffee in his hands, his mind's eye thousands of miles away, replaying the memory of a little girl in a red coat, the tight grip of a man's hand, and the sad, dying tree on the side of a white van. His only concern, the only reality that mattered to him, was the safety of the girl with the kind eyes. Dawn broke not as a brilliant explosion of light but as a slow, reluctant bleed. A cold, heavy mist clung to the Thorne property, muffling sound and turning the world into a palette of grays and muted greens. The air was still and frigid, each breath a visible cloud. Moving through this ghostly landscape, like wraiths given form, was the tactical team. They moved with a liquid silence, their black uniforms absorbing the faint, pre-dawn light. They used the approach vector Calvin had identified, slipping through the broken section of the fence on the western perimeter, a flaw in the property's defenses that was completely invisible from the main road. The only sounds were the soft, rhythmic crunch of dry leaves and damp earth under their heavy boots, a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the profound quiet, and the occasional metallic click of a weapon's safety being released, a small, sharp punctuation in the tense silence. They communicated with coordinated hand signals, a silent, deadly ballet in the gloom. Inside the barn, the darkness was nearly absolute, thick with the smells of damp hay, old chemicals, and the acrid tang of animal droppings from years past. Dust motes danced in the few slivers of light that pierced the warped wooden walls. In a small, makeshift room, little more than a sectioned, off-corner crudely walled with particle board, Lily sat on a lumpy mattress. She was scared, a cold knot of fear sitting permanently in her stomach, but she was not hysterical. A quiet, stubborn resilience had taken root in her small heart. She was showing a strength she never knew she possessed. Her captor, Marcus Thorne, was not calm. He was a caged animal, pacing the length of the barn's main floor, his limp more pronounced due to his agitation. He was startled by every sound, the creak of a floorboard, the scuttling of a mouse in the walls, the distant cry of a bird. His paranoia, fueled by days of isolation and the mounting certainty of his impending capture, was escalating into a frantic, twitching terror. He clutched a small handgun, his knuckles white, his eyes darting wildly into the shadows. The teen reached the barn's side entrance, a large sliding door that was slightly ajar. It was exactly as Calvin's intuition had suggested, a secondary point of entry, away from the main house and any likely lines of sight. With a final series of hand signals, the breach was initiated. It was not an explosive, chaotic entry, but a swift, silent flood. The door slid open with a low groan, and the teen poured inside, fanning out with practiced efficiency, their weapons mounted with lights that cut through the oppressive darkness. The surprise was total. Marcus Thorne spun around, his face a mask of disbelief and terror, his mouth opening in a silent scream. Before he could even think to raise his weapon, he was on the ground, a knee in his back, his hands being secured behind him with a sharp zip. It was over in less than 3 seconds. One officer rushed toward the makeshift room, his weapon still raised. He kicked the flimsy door open. Lily flinched back, her eyes wide with fear at the sudden noise and the sight of the large, dark figure filling the doorway. The officer immediately lowered his weapon, his posture softening. "It's okay," he said, his voice deliberately soft, a stark contrast to the controlled violence of the past few moments. "We're the police. We're here to take you home." The hospital room was the complete antithesis of the barn. It was clean, almost painfully bright, and smelled of disinfectant and fresh linen. It was a sanctuary of safety, a sterile bubble against the world's horrors. Sarah and David Thompson sat on the edge of their chairs, their anxiety a palpable force in the room. They had been told Lily was safe, that she was on her way, but they couldn't believe it, not until they saw her, held her. Every footstep in the hallway outside was a jolt to their systems, every distant voice a potential announcement. David was holding Sarah's hand, his grip so tight it was almost painful, but she clung to him, their shared tension the only thing holding them together. The door opened. A nurse with a kind, weary smile stepped inside. "She's here," the nurse said softly. And then, from behind the nurse, Lily appeared. She was wearing a hospital gown that was too big for her, her hair was matted, and there were dark circles under her eyes, but she was whole. She was alive. The moment was electric, a silent, explosive detonation of a week's worth of pent-up grief, fear, and desperate hope. Sarah let out a sob, a raw, wounded sound that came from the deepest part of her soul, and rushed forward. She didn't just hug her daughter, she enveloped her, collapsing around her as if her own bones could no longer support her. It was a hug of overwhelming, crushing relief, a desperate attempt to physically merge with her child, to ensure she could never be taken away again. David followed a half-second later, his own face, which had been a mask of stoic control for days, finally crumbling. He wrapped his arms around his wife and daughter, pulling them into a single, weeping unit, his broad shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. The air was filled with the sounds of their crying, the raw, unfiltered music of a family being pieced back together. Sarah's tears soaked Lily's hair, and she could feel the steady, strong beat of her daughter's heart against her own chest, the most beautiful rhythm she had ever heard. David buried his face in his wife's shoulder, the strength that had held him together for a week finally giving way to the simple, profound relief of a father holding his child. After the first, violent wave of emotion began to subside, they pulled back, their hands still clutching, touching, reassuring themselves that this was real. Lily looked up at her mother, her voice small and thin, a child's voice that had been silent for too long. "A man took me," she said, the words simple, factual, and utterly devastating. "I was scared." She paused, her brow furrowing as she recalled the long, terrifying hours. Then she added something that stunned them both into silence. "But I remembered the drawing man in the park. The man with the dusty fingers." Sarah and David exchanged a confused look. "He always looked so quiet and calm when he was drawing," Lily continued, her voice gaining a little more confidence. "He never looked scared. So I tried to be quiet and calm like him. I pretended I was drawing pictures in my head to make the time go away." Back at the police station, the chaotic energy of the successful operation had begun to settle into a hum of paperwork and procedure. In the same quiet briefing room, far from the noise and celebration, Calvin sat at the large table. Detective Rossi had insisted he be moved there, for his own peace and safety, away from the prying eyes of the press that had now gathered outside. She had provided him with a new, high-quality sketchbook and a full set of professional charcoal pencils. He was drawing the view from the window, a simple cityscape of rooftops and water towers, his hand moving with its usual steady grace. He was processing the day, the fear, the hope, the strange, disorienting experience, the only way he knew how. The door opened softly. It was Detective Rossi. Her face was tired, the lines of fatigue etched deeply around her eyes, but her expression was lit by a genuine, brilliant smile. "Calvin," she said, her voice soft, almost gentle. She walked over and sat in the chair next to him, not across from him. She was no longer an interrogator, she was a confidant. "We found her," she said, letting the words hang in the air. "She's safe. She's with her parents at the hospital." Rossi paused, letting the magnitude of the words sink in. She looked at his drawing, then back at his face. "You did this, Calvin," she said, her voice thick with an emotion she rarely allowed herself to show. "Your memory, your drawings, your eyes. You brought her home." Calvin's reaction was not one of triumph or excitement. There was no shout of joy, no fist pump of victory. It was a slow, profound exhalation of breath, a release of tension he hadn't even been aware he was holding. It was as if he had been holding his breath for a week, and could finally let it go. A single tear escaped from the corner of his eye and traced a clean, silent path through the charcoal dust that still smudged his cheek. He slowly lifted his head and looked at Rossi, his eyes, those incredibly observant eyes, full of a deep, unspoken question he could barely bring himself to ask. "She's really okay," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "She's really okay," Rossi confirmed, her smile widening. "A little scared, a little hungry, but she's perfect." He simply nodded, a universe of relief contained in that small, simple gesture. He looked down at his hands, at the charcoal on his fingers, and then back at the detective. For a moment, there was just a shared, silent understanding between the two of them, a bond forged in the crucible of a shared purpose. A short while later, Rossi returned. She stood in the doorway, her expression hesitant. "Calvin," she said. "There are some people here. They want to thank you." She stepped aside, and David and Sarah Thompson entered the room. They looked as if they had aged 10 years in the past week, their eyes red, rimmed and puffy from crying, but they were filled with a gratitude so immense, so powerful, it was humbling to witness. They stopped just inside the room, their gazes falling upon the quiet, disheveled man sitting at the table, the man who had given them back their world. The quiet of the briefing room was a stark contrast to the storm of emotions brewing within it. David and Sarah Thompson stood just inside the doorway, their presence filling the small space with a gratitude so profound it was almost a physical force. The contrast between them, impeccably dressed even in their exhaustion, their wealth a quiet aura around them, and Calvin, in his worn, thin jacket, his hands smudged with the charcoal that was his only constant companion, was a chasm. But for the first time, the chasm was bridged, not by pity, but by a shared, overwhelming humanity centered on the life of a little girl. David, a man accustomed to being in control, to commanding boardrooms and closing multi-million-dollar deals, struggled for words. His usual confidence had been stripped away, leaving behind the raw, humbled core of a father who had been to the edge of the abyss and back. He began, his voice thick and unsteady. He cleared his throat and tried again. Mr. Price. Calvin. There is nothing we can do, nothing in this world, that could ever repay you for what you've done. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a long, crisp envelope. He laid it on the table, his hand shaking slightly. From inside, he slid out a check. Our family's foundation has issued this. It's the reward money we offered, but we've increased it. It's $100,000. He pushed it gently across the table toward Calvin. It's the least we can do. It's not enough. It could never be enough, but it's a start. Calvin looked down at the piece of paper. The number, with its long trail of zeros, seemed unreal, an abstract concept from a world he had only ever observed from the outside. $100,000. It was a fortune, a key, a solution. It was also a weight, a complication, a burden. He looked up from the check, his gaze moving past the incredible number to the faces of the two people in front of him. He saw their red, rimmed eyes, the lingering terror behind their relief, and the desperate, boundless gratitude that was so pure it was painful to witness. He saw the parents of the girl with the kind eyes. Slowly, with a gentleness that was inherent in all his movements, he placed his palm on the check and pushed it back across the table toward them. I'm just glad she's safe, he said, his voice quiet, barely more than a whisper. The words were simple, but they held the weight of his entire truth. He had not been motivated by reward. He had been motivated by a memory of kindness, by the simple, human connection of a shared cookie on a cold day. He hesitated, a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes as he voiced a need of his own, a need so small, so humble in the face of their grand gesture, that it was heartbreaking. I don't need all that, he said, gesturing toward the check. Maybe some new pencils. The good kind? And a warm place to stay. Just for a little while. David and Sarah were stunned into silence. They stared at him, at this man who had been offered a life-changing sum of money and had, in return, asked for art supplies and temporary shelter. In that moment, they finally, truly understood. This was not about a transaction. It was not about paying a debt. It was about acknowledging a man's dignity. To him, the money was a burden, another way of being marked as different, of being managed. The pencils, the room, that was about respect. It was about seeing him, Calvin Price, not as a problem to be solved with cash, but as a person with simple, fundamental needs. Sarah's eyes, which she thought had no more tears left to cry, filled once again. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, but this one was different. It was not a tear of grief or fear, but of profound, humbling awe. Oh, Calvin, she said, her voice breaking with emotion. She reached across the table, not to push the check back, but to gently lay her hand on his. We can do much better than that. 3 months later, the sun streamed through a large, clean window, illuminating a small, simply furnished apartment. The light caught the dust motes dancing in the air, turning them into a swirling galaxy of tiny, golden stars. The room was warm, comfortable, and smelled of fresh paint and brewing coffee. In one corner, a dedicated art studio space had been created. A professional easel stood like a sentinel, holding a large, blank canvas. Beside it, a wooden chest was filled with a full set of paints, brushes of every size, and dozens of sticks of charcoal and graphite pencils, all neatly arranged. This was Calvin's new home. He stood before the easel, a cup of coffee steaming in his hand. He was clean, shaven, his hair neatly trimmed. He wore a simple, new pair of jeans and a soft, gray sweater. The clothes were not expensive, but they were clean and they fit, and on him, they looked like a king's robes. The deep, weary lines around his eyes had not vanished, they were part of his story, but the constant, hunted tension within them had been replaced by a calm, focused light. He was no longer a man surviving from moment to moment, he was a man living, a man with a future. The Thompsons, working with a compassionate and practical social worker, had been true to their word. They had done much better. They had established a trust in his name, a fund that would manage his affairs, ensuring he had a home, food, and financial security for the rest of his life, without the overwhelming burden of managing a large sum of money he had never wanted. It was a gift not of wealth, but of peace. He placed his coffee cup down and picked up a stick of charcoal. He was ready to begin his first piece on a real canvas. For weeks, he had simply been filling sketchbooks, reacquainting himself with his own talent, letting the fear and the cold seep out of his bones. But now, he was ready to create something permanent. His hand moved, and the first, confident lines appeared on the stark white canvas. He was painting a portrait, a vibrant, life-sized image of Lily. But he was not painting her as the world now knew her, the victim, the survivor. He was painting her as he first saw her, as she was in his memory, a small girl in a bright red coat, her eyes shining with an uncomplicated, profound kindness, her small hand holding out a piece of a broken cookie, an offering that had, in the end, saved them all. The gallery was a cavern of white walls and perfect, dramatic lighting. It was packed, a buzzing hive of people from every walk of life. Wealthy patrons in designer clothes mingled with art students in paint-splattered jeans. City officials rubbed shoulders with curious tourists. The air was filled with the murmur of conversation, the clinking of wine glasses, and a sense of electric anticipation. It was the opening night of a solo exhibition, an event that had become the most talked about cultural moment of the year. On the wall, a simple, elegant sign read, "The Observer, Works by Calvin Price." The gallery owner, a shrewd but genuinely passionate man named Julian, had been moved by the news story, but he had been captivated by the images of Calvin's sketchbook that had been leaked to the press. He saw beyond the sensationalism and recognized a raw, undeniable talent, a unique and powerful perspective. He had sought Calvin out through the Thompsons, not with an offer of charity, but with a professional proposition, a solo show. The crowd now moved through the space, their voices hushed with admiration as they looked at the framed prints of Calvin's charcoal sketches. The very fantasy people that had once been the subject of cruel laughter were now being hailed as masterpieces of observational art. Each sketch captured a fleeting moment of humanity, a secret story of the city that only Calvin had been patient enough to see. The Thompsons were there, standing near the entrance, their faces glowing with a fierce, protective pride. Lily stood between them, holding both their hands, looking around at the crowd with a child's wide-eyed wonder. She was healing, her natural resilience shining through. Across the room, leaning against a far wall, was Detective Isabella Rossi. She was off duty, dressed in a simple black dress, a warm, genuine smile on her face as she watched the man she had pulled from the shadows now standing in the spotlight. And in the back, standing quietly by herself, was Jenna. She had come alone, her face a mixture of remorse, guilt, and a profound, undeniable awe. She looked at the art on the walls, the art she had once dismissed with a condescending caption, and finally understood its power. The centerpiece of the exhibition, placed on a wall all its own, was the new painting. It was the life-sized portrait of Lily, now finished, vibrant, and pulsing with life. Beneath it, a small plaque read, "Kindness." People gathered before it in silence, moved by the raw emotion captured in the paint. Calvin stood near his work, a glass of water in his hand. He was deeply uncomfortable with the attention, the praise, the sheer number of people looking at him. But he was not afraid of it. The fear, the feeling of being a ghost in his own life, was gone. People approached him, not with the pity he had endured for so long, but with genuine admiration. They wanted to talk to him about his technique, about his use of light and shadow, about his perspective. They saw him. He was no longer Calvin the homeless man, a problem to be ignored or managed. He was Calvin Price, the artist. The final shot of the night, long after most of the crowd had dispersed, was of Calvin standing alone in front of his painting of Lily. He looked at the image of the girl, at the kindness in her eyes, at the offered cookie, the single, small act that had started it all. A small, genuine smile touched his lips, a smile that reached his eyes and transformed his entire face. He had found more than just a home, more than security. He had rediscovered his purpose, his dignity, and his voice. His art, born from the quiet, patient observation of a man society had deemed invisible, had not only saved a life, it had made the world see. And in seeing, the world had finally seen him.